There are moments in astronomy when a discovery doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with noise or fireworks or the dramatic spectacle people expect when they imagine the universe revealing something extraordinary. Instead, it begins with something small, something quiet, something so subtle that the mind almost filters it out. That is how the story of 3I, Atlas, begins, with a faint flicker of light drifting across the sky, so delicate it should have disappeared into the background noise of the cosmos. And yet, it didn't. It stayed. And then, slowly, it began to repeat the same whisper of brightness again and again, as if some invisible hand were gently tapping on a door that no one realized existed. At first, none of the astronomers wanted to believe that what they were seeing was real. A 0.47-second rise in brightness, followed by a 0.47-second fall, and then a short, silent pause before the same 8-pulse rhythm repeated. In the natural world, nothing behaves this way. Gas doesn't. Dust doesn't. Comets certainly don't. A comet's brightness shifts like the glow of a candle, moving through air, soft, unpredictable, chaotic, but Atlas pulsed like a machine. Clean edges, sharp transitions, perfect timing, preserved across hours of observation. And yet, because the universe is vast and full of tricks, the scientists dismissed it. Statistical noise, they said. Instrument drift. A local disturbance in the atmosphere. Anything was more plausible than the idea that this object, this interstellar visitor moving silently through our solar system, was producing a structured pattern. But then a second observatory reported the same pulses, and then a third, and a fourth, all separated by thousands of kilometers, all using different equipment, all capturing the exact same 0.47-second flicker at the exact same moment. Suddenly, the idea of noise stopped making sense. Natural randomness doesn't synchronize across continents. Randomness doesn't repeat with machine-level precision. Randomness doesn't behave like intention. The astronomers didn't say that out loud, of course. They simply exchanged long, quiet looks across computer screens, looks that said more than any report could. Something was happening. Something that did not belong to the comfortable world of comet physics and predictable orbital mechanics. The true shift came when someone tried to trace the direction of the modulated photons,
Trajectory
not their
altered.
brightness, not their timing, but their origin. When the vectors were plotted,
Warning,
the answer wasn't
deviation
the sun
detected.
or any
Trajectory
nearby source.
solved.
Instead, all the lines converged toward a dim, unremarkable star in the constellation Cygnus AEN 442, a star that had never been notable for anything. Its variations in brightness were so small that almost no one bothered to observe it. And yet, those tiny fluctuations, those micro-oscillations rippling out across space, matched the pulses detected on 3I, Atlas, with impossible accuracy. Atlas wasn't producing its own signal. It was repeating the light of AEN 442, but delayed by exactly 0.47 seconds and amplified by nearly 18%, as if it were not merely reflecting that light, but processing it, shaping it, and sending it forward. That was the moment when the scientists felt something cold slide down their spines. They understood what matching fluctuations implied. A natural object can reflect light, yes. It can scatter it, bend it, absorb it. But a natural object cannot hold a stellar pulse in its mind for nearly half a second and then repeat it more cleanly than the original. A natural object cannot amplify a photon stream. A natural object cannot behave like a node in a communication network. And yet, 3I, Atlas was doing exactly that. The more they studied the pulses, the stranger they became. When converted into binary sequences, the 8-pulse clusters displayed the kind of structure that emerges when information is being organized. Not a message, not words, not a code directly readable by any human system, but structure, intent, a sense of internal logic, like a header packet, like a synchronization frame, like an opening handshake between distant machines. Even the timing was too exact. 8 pulses, 11 seconds. 8 pulses, 11 seconds. The same for 82 hours, across 4 observatories, across 4 continents. The universe doesn't do that on its own. Then came the second realization, slow, chilling, and heavier than the first. Atlas did not appear to care that Earth existed. It didn't react to sunlight. It didn't react to being observed. It didn't change behavior as it moved deeper into the solar system. It simply continued doing what it had probably been doing long before humanity built its first telescope, receiving a variation of starlight, delaying it, and sending it onward into the void. Just another quiet link in a chain stretching across hundreds of light years. If Atlas was a relay, then Earth was not the recipient of the message. We were merely standing close enough to overhear a conversation that was never meant for us. And there is something uniquely unsettling about that idea. Not fear of the unknown, but fear of irrelevance. Fear of being a bystander in a network older, larger, and more indifferent than anything our species has ever imagined. Humanity is terrified of messages from the stars, yes, but it is far more terrifying to realize that the universe might already be full of messages, none of which are addressed to us. Even Atlas's physical behavior added to the unease. A comet should have a tail. Dust should flare from its surface as it approaches the sunday. It should leave a long, luminous trail as solar radiation strips away its outer layers. But Atlas drifted in perfect silence. No tail, no outgassing, no visible shedding of material. It moved like something dense, stable, sealed. Something that didn't react to heat the way ice or rock would. Something that looked more like an object built than an object born. The lack of tail, ironically, made its reflective modulation even cleaner. There was nothing to scatter the light, nothing to blur the edges of the pulses, nothing to soften the binary switch between brightness states. The object behaved like a mirror, an impossible, ancient, interstellar mirror, reflecting a star 300 light-years away. As the days passed and the data accumulated, a quiet shift occurred among the scientists. No one said the words out loud, but they all felt the same gravitational pull toward the same conclusion. Atlas was too consistent, too controlled, too intentional to be natural. And so, the idea of the relay returned again and again, whispering in the back of their minds. A node, a repeater, a device drifting along a predetermined path, repeating the light of one star toward another, like a signal bouncing between towers across a cosmic landscape. If that was true, then the next question became obvious. Where was the message going? If AEN 442 was the source, then what was the destination? And how many other nodes, how many other Atlas-like objects existed along the path between the two? The thought was suffocating in its scale. A network like that could span thousands of light years. It could have been built long before humanity ever took its first breath. It could still be functioning flawlessly while its creators were long extinct. And Atlas, passing near our sun, could be nothing more than a courier traveling through a postal route far older than Earth itself. The scientists didn't fear the possibility that Atlas was artificial. They feared the possibility that its purpose was mundane, ordinary, routine, that what we were witnessing wasn't a message of greeting, or warning, or threat. It was simply maintenance. A piece of cosmic infrastructure doing what it always does, unaware that a young civilization has finally noticed it. As Atlas slipped behind the sun, the pulses faded. No more flickering, no more rhythm. The object became quiet once again, as though it had never done anything unusual at all. And that, strangely, was what frightened the researchers the most.
Tracking
Not the
convergence
presence
point
of the signal, but
AEN.
its absence. Because now they had to wait. Wait to see whether the pulses would return when Atlas emerged again on the other side. Wait to see whether the pattern would evolve. Wait to see whether Earth's accidental eavesdropping had changed anything at all, or whether Atlas would continue on its ancient path, indifferent to the fact that, for the first time in its long journey, something had finally noticed it. And somewhere, in the cold vacuum between stars, the light of AEN 442 continued to ripple outward, carrying with it whatever message or instruction or echo had been drifting through the galaxy long before humanity ever learned how to look up. When 3I Atlas slipped behind the sun, a strange kind of silence settled over the observatories. Not the silence of machines powered down, nor the silence of a room emptied of people, but the deeper, heavier silence of waiting. A silence that felt like holding your breath before stepping into a dark room, unsure of what you might find inside. The disappearance wasn't unexpected, of course. Objects slip behind the sun all the time. It is nothing unusual, nothing alarming. But this time, the absence felt deliberate, as though the object had chosen to step out of sight at the very moment humanity realized it had been watching something it shouldn't have seen. There was nothing to do but wait for Atlas to emerge again. Yet the waiting itself became a kind of quiet torment, stretching across days that felt longer than they had any right to be. During that time, the scientists kept replaying the data, almost obsessively, tracing the pulse patterns as though some hidden meaning might reveal itself on the 100th review. They slowed the pulses down, sped them up, inverted them, folded them across timelines. But no matter what they did, the pattern remained
Analysis reports
consistent.
0 anomalies.
AEN 442 would brighten by a fraction of a percent, and exactly 0.47 seconds later, Atlas would do the same, as though the two objects were locked in a conversation far older than our species. It was unnerving, not because the pattern suggested intelligence, but because it suggested routine, habit, something performed so many times that even across the gulf of light years, it had become effortless. Some of the researchers began whispering among themselves about whether the delay might shift once Atlas reappeared. What if the time lag changed? What if the 8-pulse cluster evolved into a 9-pulse pattern or collapsed into 6? What if the amplitude suddenly increased? What if Atlas, after sensing that it had been observed, altered its behavior in some small but undeniable way? These questions hovered like small birds in a storm, darting in and out of every conversation, never landing, never settling. They were too afraid to say the real fear out loud. What if the signal woke up? What if something noticed that we had noticed? The official communications from agency leaders urged calm. The scientists were told to avoid speculation, to treat the observations strictly as photonic anomalies,
Gravitational
and to refrain
simulation
from
active.
discussing the matter privately.
Simulation complete.
But fear has a way
Trajectory
of
altered.
crawling through the cracks of any directive. And late at night, when the observatory halls
Warning,
emptied
deviation
and the servers
detected.
hummed
Trajectory
quietly in the
solved.
dark, the scientists found themselves staring at the ceiling, wondering whether the universe had just pulled a curtain aside and shown them something they were not prepared to understand. As the days passed, more data trickled in, not from Atlas itself, but from its gravitational behavior. Even though the object was hidden behind the sun,
if the
its subtle
signal
effects on
wakes
nearby
up?
solar radiation, on heliospheric particle flow, and even on weak solar resonances continued to reach the instruments, and the numbers told a peculiar story. They suggested that Atlas was not drifting randomly or being carried by simple gravitational inertia. Instead, tiny micro-adjustments far too small to be seen visually indicated that Atlas might be subtly aligning itself, not toward the sun, not toward Earth, but toward an invisible point, somewhere in the distant darkness of the outer solar system. A point that matched no known stellar object, no known gravitational perturbation, nothing that should have had any influence over its trajectory. When the researchers plotted the object's course with these micro-adjustments added in, they discovered something deeply unsettling. Atlas was not following a purely ballistic trajectory. It was following a path that curved ever so slightly, like a ship adjusting its sails to catch a wind only it could feel. A path that did not align with any natural orbit, but instead pointed toward a region of space empty of stars, planets, or dust clouds, empty of everything but darkness. And yet the adjustments continued, tiny and precise, as if Atlas were navigating toward a target that did not yet exist, or toward a rendezvous point that lay hundreds of years in the future. This was when the notion of a relay chain began to take shape. If Atlas was repeating the light of AEN 442, then something might be waiting on the other side, to receive it. A second node, another reflection point, another messenger drifting through the void, invisible to us not because it was too far away, but because we had never known how to look for such a thing. A network built not of radio waves or megastructures, but of drifting, ancient objects carrying faint photonic echoes across unimaginable distances. No one dared to consider how many of these relics might exist, how many might have passed near our planet without us knowing, how many messages might have flowed silently across the night sky, mere inches from human detection, unnoticed simply because no one had ever considered that light itself could be used this way. It was too large a thought, too heavy. It pressed down on the scientists like the weight of deep water, making it hard to breathe. 4 days after Atlas vanished, subtle gravitational anomalies appeared once again, this time slightly stronger, enough for the researchers at JPL to detect a faint, rhythmic fluctuation in the solar wind, not caused by the sun, nor by any known planetary interaction. It was as though Atlas were breathing in the darkness behind the sun, flexing some internal mechanism, or adjusting something within itself that we could not see. The fluctuations were small, so small they could have been dismissed as noise were it not for one detail. They occurred every 11.29 seconds, the same interval as the 8-pulse light clusters, the same signature, the same cadence. Atlas was still pulsing, still working, still relaying, but it was doing so in a way we could not observe directly, as though the object had slipped behind a veil and continued its mysterious function in secret. When Atlas finally began to emerge from behind the sun, the anticipation inside the observatories was almost unbearable. Every telescope capable of tracking its reappearance was primed, and every sensor was calibrated with obsessive precision. It was late in the day for some regions, early morning for others, but around the world, clusters of scientists sat stiffly in their chairs, staring at data streams like gamblers waiting for the roulette wheel to settle. Some expected the pulses to return immediately. Others suspected the behavior would be gone entirely, erased like chalk on a blackboard. And a few, just a few, feared something else. They feared the pattern would return, but changed, altered in a way that confirmed their darkest suspicion, that Atlas had noticed their attention. What happened was neither of these outcomes, and yet, somehow, it was worse. The first photons captured were normal, no pulses, no anomalies, just the faint, silent light of a distant object reflecting the sun in a perfectly ordinary way. Minutes passed, then hours, still nothing. A crushing disappointment filled the rooms, not the disappointment of failure, but the disappointment of losing something precious and frightening. The kind of disappointment that comes when the curtain falls on a mystery you were not ready to stop observing. But a few hours after its reappearance, something changed. Not in the light, in the timing. The object's rotation, previously estimated to be slow and steady at nearly 12 hours, showed a tiny deviation, a non-random one, a deviation so small it would have meant nothing by itself. But when the researchers compared it with the predicted trajectory derived from its earlier micro-adjustments, a chilling alignment appeared. The rotation speed was changing in sync with the same invisible vector Atlas had been adjusting toward behind the Sunday. A tiny tilt, followed by a tiny acceleration, followed by a stabilizing pause. Like a vessel aligning itself with a distant beacon, the light remained silent, but the motion spoke volumes. For the first time, the scientists confronted the possibility that Atlas was not merely reflecting a message,
convergence point,
it was preparing to send one, or to forward the next part of a conversation, or to synchronize with a node that lay far beyond our solar system, across a stretch of space humans had never charted. This possibility changed the tone in everything. Real fear settled in, not panic, not hysteria, but the cold, rational fear that comes when a truth becomes too large to hide behind comforting theories. If Atlas were part of a network, then its behavior was logical, predictable, purposeful. And purpose is the one thing natural objects should never have. The scientists monitored it deep into the night, whispering their thoughts in tones meant to reassure themselves rather than each other. They wondered if the relay network was old, older than Earth, older than humanity, older than the languages we use to describe such things. They wondered if the message being carried had been traveling long before life developed on our planet. They wondered whether the creators of the network still existed, or whether this was the last remnant of a civilization that vanished before humans ever walked upright. But the question that haunted them most was not who built the network, nor what the message meant. It was whether Earth had become part of that message, merely by observing it. Whether awareness itself had changed something subtle in the chain. Whether the act of looking had made us visible to things that drift across the dark in the spaces between stars. And somewhere, far beyond the reach of our telescopes, the next node, if it existed, waited in silence, unseen, unheard, perhaps drifting as quietly as Atlas, perhaps watching, perhaps listening, perhaps continuing a work so ancient that even the stones of Earth were young when it began. The pulses would return eventually. Everyone knew that. The universe does not abandon its routines so easily. But until that moment came, the scientists were left with only their data, their doubts, and the quiet, dreadful realization that sometimes the scariest messages are not the ones sent to you, but the ones you overhear by accident. When the pulses finally returned, they did not begin with light. They began with a tremor so small, so faint, that most systems filtered it out automatically. A vibration buried inside the static of solar wind data, riding on the back of charged particles drifting between the sun and the Earth. A whisper inside a whisper. It was discovered accidentally by a researcher too tired to trust his eyes, but too exhausted to stop looking at numbers that were no longer telling him what he wanted to hear. The tremor showed itself as a slight fluctuation in proton density, repeating every 11.29 seconds, the same timing, the same cadence, the same silent heartbeat that had once echoed inside the light of Atlas. But this time it was hidden, as if the signal were passing through a layer of cloth, muted but unmistakable. And once the pattern was recognized, it became impossible to ignore. The tremor was everywhere, weak, scattered, diffused through particle streams that had no reason to carry such information. Yet there it was, like the faintest ripple left behind after something
Gravitational
enormous had
simulation
moved through
active.
deep water. Atlas
Simulation
had emerged
complete.
from behind the sun,
Trajectory altered.
and the pulses had returned before its light ever changed. The realization did not arrive all
Warning,
at once.
deviation
It crept into the
detected.
minds of the
Trajectory
researchers slowly,
solved.
like a cold draft in a sealed room. Atlas was pulsing again, but it was doing so internally, or through some method that bypassed direct optical detection. It was as if the object had shifted into a quieter mode, a deeper mode, continuing its work without revealing itself openly, as though it understood that eyes were watching. The deeper the analysts looked, the more the data seemed to behave like an echo of the original AEN 442 pulses, but stretched, diffused, and carried on medium that should not have been able to preserve any meaningful signal. Light can carry information. That much is simple. But solar wind? Random particle diffusion across millions of kilometers? That should have erased any structure instantly. And yet, the structure persisted. Something was shaping it. Something was forcing it into place. Something that operated with a precision quiet enough to hide beneath the noise of space itself. The scientists began to realize a terrifying possibility. Perhaps Atlas did not merely reflect signals. Perhaps it absorbed them, processed them, and then expelled their faint residues into the environment around it, leaving behind microscopic imprints on everything it touched. The idea of a relay node began to evolve into something larger, more complex. A relay that modified the space around it. A relay that whispered into the fabric of the solar wind. A relay that worked even when unseen. As Atlas moved further from the sun's obscuring glare, its physical form became visible again, but it did not look like it had before. Subtle differences began to appear, differences too small to declare openly, too delicate to be certain, but undeniable once noticed. Its surface reflectivity had shifted. The light coming off it seemed slightly more coherent, slightly more focused, as though the object were tightening itself preparing for something. The absence of a tail remained. The lack of dust remained. But the surface looked smoother, darker in certain angles, brighter in others. It looked less like rock or ice, and more like something maintained. When the first proper brightness spike appeared, just a tiny one, barely 0.2% above baseline, the observatories caught it instantly. It was not the old 8-pulse sequence. It was something shorter, quicker. A single flash lasting only 0.19 seconds. Then silence for 20 minutes. Then another flash. Another 0.19 seconds. Over and over. Regular, controlled, deliberate. This was not AEN 442. The timing didn't match. The signature didn't match. The flashes were new. Atlas was no longer repeating someone else's signal. It was generating something on its own. No one knew how to interpret this. The 8-pulse cluster had been strange, but at least it was understandable, one stellar source mirroring another, delayed through a mechanism that resembled a communication protocol. But this new sequence felt different. It felt like an announcement. The scientists tried to decode it. They ran it through every filter they had: binary, trinary, Fourier transforms, wavelet analyses, compression algorithms, quantum noise comparisons, but nothing revealed a message. There was no pattern the human mind could grasp. The flashes were too short, too isolated. They were like punctuation marks without words, footsteps without the walker. But the cadence was undeniable. Every 20 minutes, a small, bright, deliberate flash, sometimes stronger, sometimes slightly weaker. The variation felt like breathing. As the hours passed, the flashes began to shift, slowly at first, then with more confidence, as though the object were warming up, stretching a mechanism that had been dormant for centuries. The flashes shortened to 0.18 seconds, then 0.17. The intervals tightened. 20 minutes became 18, then 16. The changes were small, but enough to feel like watching something awaken from a long sleep. The tension in the observatories thickened. People stopped speaking loudly. They stopped making jokes. They stopped sipping coffee mid-sentence. They watched and listened and waited, because they knew, every one of them knew, that this was no longer just a reflection of some distant star. This was Atlas itself, acting. Then, without warning, the flashes stopped. The object grew perfectly quiet, perfectly steady, and for a moment, it seemed as if the entire world exhaled, at once relieved and terrified in the same breath. The silence lasted for exactly 3 hours. 3 hours of nothingness. 3 hours of waiting for the next pulse, the next anomaly, the next whisper from a messenger that shouldn't exist. Then, in the heart of that silence, Atlas changed direction. Not dramatically, not enough for the public to notice, or for orbital predictions to fail, but enough for those watching closely to feel the shock of it ripple through them. A deviation of 0.003 degrees. A shift too smooth to be caused by gravitational nudge, too soft to be outgassing, too controlled to be coincidence. It was the kind of shift a spacecraft would make when realigning itself with a target. It was the kind of shift that contains intent. Atlas wasn't drifting, it was aiming. The new trajectory didn't point toward Earth. That would have been too easy, too convenient, almost comforting in its drama. Instead, it pointed toward a volume of space with nothing in it. No planets, no asteroids, no debris, just a cold, silent region of emptiness on the edge of our solar system. And yet the vector
Tracking
was
convergence
precise.
point
Atlas
AEN.
was navigating toward that emptiness, as though something waited for it there. Something invisible. Something we had no instruments to detect. One researcher whispered, almost involuntarily, "It's aligning with the next node." The room went still, not because the theory was absurd, but because it fit too well, too cleanly, too perfectly with everything the data suggested. If Atlas was a relay, then it made sense for it to reposition itself after completing one part of its cycle. It made sense for it to transition from echoing AEN 442 to preparing for its next destination. A node doesn't stay still. A node passes a message along. and Atlas was moving exactly the way a messenger should. But the most frightening realization was still to come. Hours after the trajectory shift, when the scientists replayed the data in slow motion, they noticed something hidden inside the last few brightness spikes, something that had gone unnoticed in real time. The pulses weren't identical. They weren't single flashes. Inside each 17-second burst, there were microscopic oscillations, tiny, rapid flickers so fast that no human eye could detect them, but unmistakable inside high-resolution analysis. There were 8 of them, 8 tiny pulses, nested inside a larger pulse. The same pattern as before, 8 beats, a pause, 8 beats, a pause now compressed into miniature form, hidden inside a new signal. The echo of the original relay, a signature, a watermark, like a ghost of the old message, living inside the new one. Atlas had not stopped relaying. It had changed languages. The researchers stared at the graphs in numb silence. The meaning was beyond them. They knew they were witnessing something ancient, something vast, something operating on a scale of time and distance
Analysis
far
reports
beyond
0
anything
anomalies.
human. And they felt something else, something deeper, something colder. They felt watched, not directly, not like prey, but like witnesses to something private, something they were not supposed to see. And somewhere across the darkness, perhaps hundreds of light years away, perhaps only a few, something might have been listening. The pulses continued to shrink in duration. The intervals continued to tighten. The trajectory continued to curve toward that invisible point. The system was changing, preparing, aligning for what came next. And the scientists could only watch, powerless, entranced, terrified, unable to shake the quiet, gnawing suspicion that the moment Atlas emerged from behind the sun, humanity had stopped being an observer and had become part of the system, part of the chain, part of the relay, part of a message that had nothing to do with us, and yet included us all the same. In the cold silence between stars, the echo deepened, and Atlas drifted on. There are moments in a story where the tension does not rise through action, but through understanding, through the slow, creeping realization of what has been in front of you the entire time. Part 4 begins in such a moment. For as Atlas continued drifting toward that empty region at the edge of the solar system, the scientists found
Gravitational
themselves
simulation
staring at a
active.
truth too heavy to lift all
Simulation
at once.
complete.
The object
Trajectory
was not merely
altered.
repeating something. It was following a script older than our species.
Warning,
older than
deviation
our
detected.
language,
Trajectory
older than the planet
solved.
that gave rise to both. By the end of the second week, after Atlas's trajectory shift, a new kind of data began to surface. Not light, not wind, not pulses hidden inside pulses. This time it came from deep space radars, those massive, silent machines that sweep the void with slow,
What if
deliberate
the
waves.
signal
Not
wakes
searching for
up?
anything in particular, simply
What
maintaining
if
their
the
routines the same way
signal
Atlas
wakes
seemed to
up?
maintain its own. The radars detected faint distortions, barely measurable, rippling through space ahead of Atlas. Not objects, not signals, just tiny changes in the way the radar waves returned, as if something transparent, something invisible, something without mass, was moving between the radar and the darkness. At first, the distortions were dismissed, radar ghosts, calibration drift. But when the distortions aligned perfectly with the vector Atlas had adopted, the tone in the labs shifted. One distortion could be noise, 2 distortions could be error. But a chain of distortions, each spaced nearly the same distance apart, each sitting along the same invisible line that Atlas was following, this was not noise. This was structure. Someone whispered the phrase no one wanted to say aloud, a corridor. And suddenly, the idea seemed painfully obvious. A corridor of invisible disturbances. A corridor mapped out by something long before Atlas ever entered our solar system. A corridor made of nothing detectable by human senses, but unmistakable in its precision once radar finally touched it with enough sensitivity. If the corridor existed, then Atlas was not choosing a direction. It was following one. Not random, not wandering, not drifting. Following, with purpose. The scientists began to reconstruct the corridor's geometry, mapping the distortions backward as far as the radar systems could detect, and what they found chilled them, even through the comfort of fluorescent light and familiar Earth gravity. The corridor extended far beyond the solar system, far beyond the heliopause, far into interstellar space, a line carved not physically, but mathematically, across distances no human explorer had ever crossed. It was a road, not a literal road, not a structure, but a pathway, a trajectory so consistent that even across light years, the distortions followed the same spacing, the same angle, the same arrangement like beads on a string that stretched into eternity. How old did something have to be for its footprint to stretch across light years? How powerful did its creators have to be to leave a line through space that persisted across cosmic time? The scientists did not know. And knowledge became its own form of fear. As the mapping continued, something stranger emerged. Each distortion in the corridor seemed to have a faint spectral signature, barely detectable, but real. A residue of energy, something decayed, something faint, as though whatever carved the pathway had not merely passed through space, but had imprinted itself upon it, not through mass, not through gravity, but through resonance, through a kind of vibration that left scars too gentle to see, but too persistent to erase. One researcher described it as cosmic fingerprints. Another called them echo nodes. The name didn't matter. What mattered was the implication. The corridor was not random. It was engineered, or at least formed, by something acting with intention. Something that understood space on a scale humanity had never imagined. And Atlas was following this corridor with the accuracy of a train on rails. As days passed, more pieces of the puzzle emerged. When the spectral residue from one distortion was isolated and amplified, something astonishing happened. The residue itself contained microvariations, tiny energy fluctuations repeating at the same 0.47-second interval as Atlas's earlier pulses. The same signature, the same cadence, but far older. The residue had degraded, stretched by time, worn by the slow abrasion of cosmic winds, but the rhythm remained. Atlas was not the only node to ever traverse this corridor, and it was not the first. A silence heavier than any in previous weeks settled over the scientific community. What they were observing was not a single object acting alone. It was part of a chain one link, in a line stretching across distances so immense that human language struggled to describe them. Light years meant nothing here. Time meant nothing here. These objects, whatever they were, might have been traveling for millions of years, billions, across epochs in which entire civilizations could rise and fall without ever noticing the faint flicker of a message passing quietly overhead. The idea was not merely unsettling, it was humbling in a way that bordered on terror. If Atlas had followed this path across the void, then what else might be following behind it? What preceded it? What fragments of lost messages had drifted across the galaxy unnoticed? How many silent watchers had skimmed the edges of our solar system long before we learned how to measure a pulse of light? One night, long after most of the research staff had gone home, a single astrophysicist sat staring at a frequency plot on her screen. She was exhausted, mentally frayed, trying to make sense of a minor anomaly in the spectral residue. As she adjusted the scaling, a shape emerged, faint, imperfect, but unmistakable. The microvariations in the residue matched not only the cadence of Atlas, but the cadence of AEN 442. Both rhythms existed in the same echo, two sources, two stars. Two pulses merged into one vibration, like the blurred trace left behind when two voices overlap in a long, fading shout. Whatever had passed through the corridor before Atlas had been carrying messages from more than one star. It had been part of a network, not a simple relay chain of points, but a mesh, a lattice, a web stretched across multiple star systems, each node passing fragments of light, fragments of patterns, fragments of meaning onward to the next. A galaxy-wide optical nervous system, not fast, not sophisticated by human standards, but ancient and resilient and impossibly vast. The implications were overwhelming, so overwhelming that for a moment, She felt physically dizzy, as if the floor itself had shifted beneath her. And then, another thought, darker, sharper, cut through the haze. If the residue contained echoes of signals from multiple stars, then Atlas was not merely repeating one message. It was continuing a message that had persisted across unimaginable distances, carried by countless predecessors. A message so important that it justified a chain of relay nodes spanning hundreds or thousands of light years. But why? What message could possibly be worth such effort? Who was it intended for? And how many civilizations had arisen and died in the time it took that message to travel from sender to recipient? When she showed the plot to her colleagues the next morning, the room fell into silence. A silence too deep for comfort. Not the silence of awe, but the silence of minds touching the edge of something they had no frame of reference for. They stared at the graph, unable to speak, as though the faint lines of decayed energy contained a truth too large to fit inside the skull of any living human. Over the next few days, the research teams attempted to reconstruct the corridor in three-dimensional space, using the spectral
Analysis
residues
reports
as markers.
0 anomalies.
Every node in the corridor represented an object like Atlas, an interstellar traveler following the same ancient road. But when the map extended far enough, something horrifying emerged. The corridor curved, not randomly, not subtly, but with intent. The curve traced an arc that projected forward would eventually intersect a point deep inside the Milky Way's galactic disk, a point dense with stars, a point where thousands of systems clustered like grains of sand in a cosmic tide, a point that could easily host life, civilizations, networks. And if the curvature of the corridor was deliberate, then the destination of the entire relay chain might be far closer to the heart of the galaxy than the place where the message began. A message traveling outward from the spiral arm toward the core. A message sent from a fading place to a brighter one. From the cold to the warm. From the outskirts to the center. No one said it aloud, but every scientist in that room felt the truth vibrate in their bones. The network was designed to send something toward the center of the galaxy. A warning, a memory, a last breath of a dying civilization. No one knew. And as Atlas moved deeper into the empty region toward the next distortion point, one final anomaly appeared. An anomaly that none of their models could predict. The object
Gravitational
slowed down,
simulation
only
active.
slightly, only perceptibly
Simulation
in the most
complete.
sensitive
Trajectory
measurements.
altered.
But the deceleration was real, measured, controlled, as if Atlas
Warning,
were preparing to
deviation
meet
detected.
something,
Trajectory
preparing to hand
solved.
something off, preparing for the next node, preparing to release whatever message it had carried for longer than any human civilization had existed. And as the scientists watched the numbers shift, as they saw the speed drop by just 1 part in 10 million, they felt something they had not expected. Grief, not fear, not awe,
What if
grief.
the signal
For they realized,
wakes up?
suddenly, painfully,
What
that they were
if
not
the
witnessing the beginning of a
signal
message.
wakes up?
They were witnessing the end of one. They were watching Atlas reach the final part of its task, an errand so long, so old, so distant, that nothing alive on Earth could comprehend the scale of devotion required to complete it. And in the silence of that realization, one thought drifted across every mind in the room, unspoken but shared. How many messages have ended before they ever reached their destination? How many have passed Earth unnoticed? How many remains of ancient networks lie drifting in the dark, forgotten by the senders and useless to the receivers, still carrying light from ghosts that no longer exist? As Atlas slowed further, as the corridor grew clearer, as the echo deepened, the mystery only tightened around the hearts of those watching. Because now the question was no longer what Atlas was relaying, but whether anything still lived at the place the message was meant for, and whether the next node, wherever it was, still waited for Atlas in the dark. In the days leading up to the encounter, the scientists found themselves speaking more quietly than usual, as though their voices might somehow travel across space and disturb the dark machinery they were watching. Even the hum of computers seemed softer, gentler, almost reverent. Something was coming, something Atlas had been moving toward since long before humanity learned to measure stars. Something it had slowed down for, aligned for, prepared for in the silent grammar of motion and timing. The object was gliding toward the next part of its ancient script. It began with another shift, subtle, almost graceful. Atlas tilted its orientation by less than half a degree, but the movement was so impossibly smooth that even the most hardened skeptics felt a chill when the data updated. Natural objects don't move like this. Not with that precision, not with that intention. The shift was the kind you'd expect from a craft designed to navigate corridors carved across light years. But it wasn't the tilt itself that disturbed them. It was what the tilt pointed toward, a region that still appeared empty through every sensor humanity possessed. No asteroid fields, no dwarf planets, no dust clouds, just a cold, black void. Yet something in that void distorted the faint residues left behind by the corridor nodes. The distortions grew sharper and strangely rhythmic, as though Atlas were approaching the mouth of a tunnel, not made of matter, but of pure intention, etched invisibly into space. They began calling it the null point, not because it contained nothing, but because it contained the kind of nothing that felt engineered, a hollow shaped not by the randomness of nature, but by design. As Atlas drifted closer, strange behaviors emerged in the solar wind surrounding it. The particles didn't scatter randomly or collide chaotically. Instead, they flowed in smooth arcs around Atlas, as if guided by a magnetic field too faint to detect. It was like watching a river bend gracefully around a stone. And the closer Atlas came to the null point, the more the river seemed to recognize the stone's presence. Radiation dipped. Random cosmic noise evaporated. The environment grew unnervingly quiet, as though space itself were softening in anticipation. Then, for the first time in weeks, the pulses returned. Not the reflections of AEN 442, not the compressed echoes. Something new, gentler, slower. Every 38 minutes, Atlas emitted a faint, soft glow, barely more than a whisper of light. Not sharp, not rhythmic, more like a pale exhale into the void. The first time it happened, the scientists stared in confusion. When the second glow came exactly 38 minutes later, they knew. Atlas wasn't signaling outward. It was signaling inward through itself, preparing for something ahead. Somewhere beyond the null point lay the next node of the network. Still, nothing was visible in the region ahead. No structure, no mass, no infrared signature, just a darkness thicker than the space around it. Then, after dozens of enhanced scans, the faintest silhouette appeared. A shadow made of absence. A circular void, about 3 kilometers across, not blocking light, but bending it. A shape made not from matter, but from distortion. A presence defined by what it erased. Until now, the universe had shown nothing like it, and yet Atlas recognized it instantly, slowing its pulses and softening its glow as if bowing to something old and sacred. The object drifted into the null point, and every observing instrument flickered, not violently, but like a candle reacting to a brief draft. When the sensors stabilized, the readings were unnervingly clean. Background static disappeared. Solar wind fluctuations flattened. Space became unnaturally quiet, almost unnaturally perfect. It was as though Atlas had stepped behind a curtain where the universe's natural noise was simply muted. Inside that unnatural quiet, another object revealed itself. Smaller, denser, sharper, roughly 600 meters across. A near-perfect sphere of darkness, not reflective, not radiant, not even textured. It was darker than the void behind it, like the shadow of something that had never been illuminated. This was not an asteroid, not a fragment, not a natural remnant. This was a node.
Tracking convergence point.
It didn't pulse. It simply existed with the stillness of a locked door. Yet Atlas reacted to it. The pulses slowed to 1 every 2 hours. Its rotation eased further. Its trajectory flattened in a perfect line, connecting it to the waiting sphere. The precision was breathtaking, so perfect it felt like a ritual. And then, for 80 long minutes, Atlas did absolutely nothing. The silence during those minutes was suffocating. Even the scientists watching from Earth felt the weight of a cause older than their species. No one spoke. The silence wasn't empty. It was full, full of something approaching resolution. Then Atlas emitted a soft flare, its faintest, gentlest glow so far. A shimmer that lasted barely a heartbeat. Not a beam, not a reflection. A whisper of light aimed directly at the waiting sphere, like a final breath delivered after a journey of millions of years. And the waiting node answered not with light or energy, but by becoming slightly, impossibly brighter, a fraction of a percent, enough to prove that it was not dormant, enough to prove that it had been waiting. Atlas drifted closer. The two objects moved toward each other with a kind of ceremonial elegance. Two ships on a dark ocean, exchanging secrets no living creature would ever understand. When Atlas reached within a few kilometers, the darkness around the sphere rippled, one delicate ripple, like the faintest tremor of fabric disturbed by a hand. Inside that ripple, a pattern flashed for less than a millisecond. 8 tiny pulses, degraded, ancient, barely alive. The same pattern that had first been noticed from AEN 442, the same sequence that had carried itself across relay after relay, slowly dissolving over cosmic time. The waiting node was not silent. It was tired. Atlas responded with its longest pulse yet, an 8-second glow that lit nothing, illuminated nothing, but carried weight, like a final offering placed on an altar built before human language existed. The waiting node absorbed the glow completely, leaving no reflection, no scattering, no trace of the light. It was a handoff, a transfer, a completion. And then it was over. The pulses stopped. The distortions vanished. The corridor's echo dissolved into background space. The waiting node faded from detection, as though sinking beneath an invisible sea. Atlas dimmed into a lifeless, ordinary object, its purpose complete, its ancient duty discharged. What remained was not knowledge, not clarity, not revelation. What remained was a feeling, the quiet, aching understanding that humanity had just witnessed the end of something immeasurably old. A message delivered across distances too vast for any living intelligence to comprehend. A memory carried across epochs where entire civilizations may have risen, burned brightly, vanished, and left behind nothing but faint shells drifting through the dark. The scientists realized, painfully, that they had not witnessed the beginning of communication. They had witnessed the last page of a story whose first chapter had been written millions of years
Gravitational
before.
simulation active.
Atlas had not arrived to speak
Simulation
to Earth.
complete.
It had arrived
Trajectory altered.
simply to finish what it had always been meant to do, to pass its memory to the next node
Warning,
in a network
deviation
whose
detected.
creators may
Trajectory
have become
solved.
dust long before Earth formed. As the object drifted onward, empty and unresponsive, the same thought settled like cold mist over every observer on Earth. The universe is full of messages that no longer have readers, and couriers that no longer have destinations. And some of them, like Atlas, are still moving, still honoring paths laid down by hands that vanished before our world learned its first word. Long after Atlas completed its silent rendezvous with the waiting node and drifted into a kind of post-purpose stillness, the scientists found themselves unable to return to their ordinary rhythms. Something fundamental had shifted, not in the data streams, not in the machinery humming quietly through the night, but in their relationship with the sky itself. Before Atlas, the universe had felt vast, mathematical, and distant. After Atlas, it felt inhabited by memory, by echoes of events older than the Earth, older than language, older than human imagination. In the weeks following the encounter, Atlas remained perfectly silent. No pulses, no maneuvers, no anomalies. It was now indistinguishable from space debris, its extraordinary nature hidden beneath ordinary appearances. And yet, the scientists could not accept that the story had simply ended. They watched the object obsessively, clinging to the hope that something, some faint flicker, some resonance, some gesture, might reveal a final piece of meaning. But there was nothing, only silence. Still, the corridor remained. The distortions Atlas had followed did not vanish completely. They lingered like a fading blueprint, faint outlines preserved in radar reflections and spectral resonance. Teams continued mapping the corridor, tracing it farther outward, reconstructing its geometry, one echo at a time. The deeper they pushed, The more fragmented the residues became. Thin, brittle, exhausted signatures, barely holding together after centuries of decay. The network had not just aged, it had withered. The realization came quietly one evening when a young mathematician isolated the microvariations inside one of the corridor residues and discovered, with sinking dread, that the information had degraded beyond recognition long before Atlas reached the solar system. If the original message had once been rich, filled with ideas, instructions, warnings, stories, identities, those ideas had dissolved into noise hundreds of thousands of years earlier. All that remained were timing patterns, skeletons of signals, ribs without the body, rhythm without the song. Atlas had not been carrying a message at all. It had been carrying the memory of a message. The weight of this realization spread through the scientific community like a slow, heavy fog. If the civilization that created the network still existed, it had forgotten its own message. If it had vanished, then the couriers it left behind had continued their devotions long after the purpose evaporated. The universe had preserved the messenger long after the meaning died. Atlas had been the last echo of a system too faithful to stop, too blind to understand what it had lost. Humanity, in witnessing Atlas, had not stumbled upon communication. It had stumbled upon grief, cosmic, ancient grief. One night, unable to sleep, a senior astronomer walked out behind the observatory and stared up at the sky with an emotion that felt strangely like mourning. He thought of Atlas drifting onward, purposeless and quiet, of the waiting node darkening again, of the corridor fading, of the message dissolving into nothing long before Earth's first microbes existed. Humanity had not intercepted a secret meant for them. They had interrupted a funeral procession already millions of years underway. Yet even in this sadness, a kind of fragile beauty emerged. The sheer stubbornness of the network, its refusal to die, its insistence on completing a mission long after forgetting why it mattered. Then, unexpectedly, the waiting node stirred, not dramatically, not visibly, but in the faintest shift in how it absorbed cosmic radiation so subtle it required hours of verification. The node was not dormant. It was processing, not intelligently, not meaningfully, but persistently, like a seed trying to retain the last bit of moisture in a desert. It was holding what Atlas had given it, storing it, preserving it, even though there was nothing coherent left. This small, quiet act broke something open in the researchers. They had hoped for a revelation, and instead they received a mirror, one that reflected something deeply human. Rituals survive meaning. Traditions outlive memory. Structures persist when purposes fade. Even the most advanced civilization cannot preserve the content of its messages forever, but it can preserve the act of sending them. The more the scientists studied the waiting node's faint radiation shifts, the clearer the truth became. The node was stabilizing itself, not to transmit, not to evolve, but to protect what little remained. It was a tomb, a cosmic archive of something unreadable, a sarcophagus carrying a fossil of information whose living form had disappeared into the void ages ago. It was not a warning beacon, not a navigation tool, not a communication engine. It was simply a remembrance passed from one silent courier to another. As the implications sank in, many of the researchers struggled with sleep. Some wept quietly, not out of fear, but because they had witnessed the final chapter of a story whose beginning would never be known. Atlas had served faithfully. The waiting node had accepted its burden, and the universe had continued on, indifferent to the weight of their devotion. Yet, in this indifference, they found something strangely comforting. If Atlas had persisted for millions
Tracking
of years,
convergence
if the
point,
waiting
8
node had
p.m.
remained ready in the dark for even longer, then humanity had not intruded. Humanity had borne witness. Perhaps that was enough. For the message had never been meant for Earth, but its journey, its integrity, its endurance, these were universal truths. They spoke of civilizations rising and falling, of knowledge dissolving and memories fading, of systems outlasting their creators, of meaning evaporating while structure persisted, of loyalty continuing long after purpose died. The universe was full of travelers carrying burdens they no longer understood. and Atlas had simply been one of them. In the years that followed, the corridor residues continued to fade. The waiting node grew quieter. Atlas drifted deeper into the void, stripped of purpose, but still moving with the inertial dignity of something that had once mattered. The scientists began to accept that there would be no second awakening, no final clue, no revelation hidden beneath the silence. But humanity would remember. The observatories would remember. The data would remember. The night sky itself, sadder, heavier, older, would remember. For the universe had whispered its softest truth. Sometimes the most beautiful messages are the ones that no longer mean anything but continue anyway. And with that, the tale of Atlas faded back into the darkness. It had come from one more ghost, traveling through a galaxy full of forgotten prayers. Long after the scientists accepted that Atlas had delivered the final remnants of its forgotten message, something subtle began to shift, not in the object, not in the waiting node, but in the minds of the people who had witnessed its long, slow ritual. They found themselves unable to return to their ordinary rhythms. The silence surrounding Atlas's journey lingered in their thoughts like a faint aftertaste that refused to fade, an invisible pressure beneath the surface of their routines. They had seen the end of something ancient, something older than Earth, older than language, older than memory, and in doing so, they had inherited a responsibility they could not articulate. They could no longer chase the meaning of the message, because the meaning was gone. All they could chase now was understanding not of why the message had been sent, but of what it meant to witness its ending. In the months that followed, their focus shifted toward the lingering distortions left in space by the relay chain. These distortions were faint, almost imperceptible, delicate fingerprints scattered far beyond the primary corridor Atlas had followed. At first, they resembled random dust motes, tiny irregularities in space that could easily have been noise. But as hundreds of data sets were layered, compared, aligned, and filtered, a quiet truth began to take shape. The relay chain had not been a single line. It had not even been a tidy network. What emerged instead was the haunting outline of a shattered constellation, broken pathways, half-erased arcs, abandoned routes drifting through the galaxy, like cobwebs left behind after an ancient structure collapsed. Some distortions ran parallel to each other. Some branched outward toward dead stars. Some pointed inward
Gravitational
toward
simulation
the densely
active.
packed stellar regions
Simulation
near the
complete.
galactic core.
Trajectory
And
altered.
others ended abruptly in empty space, like roads washed away by time.
Warning.
It took months
Deviation
before the
detected.
scientists understood
Trajectory
what they were
solved.
seeing. These were fragments, remnants of other routes taken by other couriers in ages so remote that even their ghostly signatures had faded into nothingness. Atlas had not been one of a handful. Atlas had been one of many. The galaxy had once been filled with these silent travelers drifting, pulsing, passing their memories along an ancient network that spanned unfathomable distances. And now almost all of them were gone. Time had broken them. Gravity had disrupted their pathways. Supernovae had erased entire branches. Black holes had claimed routes that once thrived. The network had deteriorated slowly, not through violence but through cosmic erosion on a scale beyond human comprehension. Atlas had not survived because it was strong or special. It had survived because it had simply avoided catastrophe long enough to complete its final task. When the scientists finally understood this, they felt a deep, numbing sorrow. They realized that they had not witnessed the end of a single messenger. They had witnessed the end of an entire civilization's desperate attempt to preserve memory against time. And though the message had died long before it reached the solar system, the act of delivering it had continued. That devotion alone carried weight. Driven by a need to understand the network's full extent, the researchers began poring through decades of astronomical archives. Searching for overlooked anomalies, they combed through background radiation maps, dismissed signal spikes, unclassified noise, half-forgotten instrument logs, anything that might hold a trace of the ancient system. It took weeks of sleepless work before they found the first hint, a faint, broken pulse buried in 8-year-old data from an old survey instrument. The signal was erratic and weak, barely a whisper, but it repeated every 79 minutes, long after it should have dissolved into randomness. It was not from Atlas, not from the waiting node. It originated from somewhere deeper inside the galaxy, aligned with several of the fragmented routes. When the team processed and cleaned the signal, it felt like hearing a heartbeat through 3 walls of concrete. Weak, faltering, but undeniably alive. This was another courier, broken, degraded, lost, but still drifting, still carrying its fragment of a forgotten message. And the more they searched, the more remnants they found. Faint signatures scattered across the sky, each with its own rhythm. None as strong or coherent as Atlas, but all bearing the unmistakable cadence of the ancient network. Some pulsed slowly, like the heartbeat of something dying. Some pulsed rapidly, like sparks flickering before they vanish. Some flickered in short bursts, like neurons firing in a deteriorating brain. All of them were damaged. All of them were fading. The researchers began to understand that they were observing not just a single system's end, but the dying neurons of a galactic mind, long gone cold. The galaxy had once been threaded with messages, millions of them blinking silently from star to star. Now only a handful remained, each one reduced to fragments of a message whose meaning had evaporated eons ago. And yet the couriers persisted. The scientists created a map of remnants, stitching together every detectable trace. What emerged was not a network, but a ruin, a cosmic city seen from orbit long after its collapse. Crumbling avenues, collapsed bridges, empty foundations. The structure had been magnificent once, but only its skeleton remained. Still, the ruins were enough. Seeing them stirred something fragile in the scientists, something like awe, tinged with grief but also with reverence. These fragments proved that intelligence had not been rare in the galaxy, that purpose had once been shared across light years, that civilizations had once spoken to each other in a language of light, and that they had loved their knowledge enough to send it across time even when survival was no longer guaranteed. And even though the message was gone, its echo had found witnesses. In one of the final meetings before the research project was archived, the team debated how to present the findings to the world. Publishing them as evidence of extraterrestrial intelligence felt wrong, too sensational, too crude. Presenting them as a scientific report felt equally wrong, too cold, too clinical. After hours of quiet discussion, they reached a conclusion. The remnants were not a discovery to celebrate or exploit. They were a graveyard, a relic, a memorial. And so the data was archived, gently handled with care, annotated with respect, sealed with a sense of ceremony rather than triumph. No one fully understood the message. No one ever would. But understanding the message was not the point anymore. The point was the existence of the network, and the devotion embedded in every fading pulse. One senior astronomer, moved beyond words, wrote a private reflection that the team passed among themselves in the months that followed. We did not uncover a message. We uncovered its shadow. Meaning dies. Memory fades. But devotion outlives even its own purpose. The galaxy is full of ghosts, not because something went wrong, but because something once went right. And so the scientists let the network rest. Atlas drifted, the waiting nodes slept, the fragments flickered, the ruins waited. And humanity, newborn by cosmic time, became a custodian of a story older than its own planet, carrying forward the quiet truth that some journeys continue long after their meaning is gone, simply because continuing is the last thing a message knows how to do. For months after the discovery of the drifting remnants, those faint, broken pulses scattered across the galaxy like dying neurons, humanity lived with an unsettling duality.
Tracking convergence point.
On the one
8
hand,
p.m.
the relay network had proven beyond any doubt that intelligence had once flickered across vast stretches of space, leaving behind traces older than the continents of Earth. On the other, the network's decay made it painfully clear that even the greatest civilizations were vulnerable to the slow erosion of cosmic time. The scientists who had spent years studying Atlas found themselves drawn into a new phase of their journey. They could no longer chase the message itself, because the message was gone. What they could chase instead was its aftermath, its shadows, its fragments, its echoes. Thus began what they quietly called the Echo Archive. The archive was not a physical place at first. It was an idea, a recognition that the remnants deserved more than just storage in cold data vaults. They were the final traces of a galactic whisper, fading so gently that even acknowledging them felt like touching something sacred. The scientists gathered every fragment into a single, unified data set. The flickers from lost couriers, the spectral residues from ancient nodes, the ghostly distortions carved into the corridor, the tiny gravitational irregularities left behind by pathways that no longer existed. Each fragment was weak, each one incomplete. But together, they formed something the researchers could finally study, not a message, but a pattern of persistence. As the archive grew, a strange phenomenon occurred among the team. They began referring to the remnants not as signals or artifacts, but as voices, even though they knew no voice remained. They spoke of the ones who built the network, not as aliens or ancestors of some unknown species, but as the predecessors, as though these ancient builders were distant relatives whose absence still left an emotional impact. The more deeply the scientists immersed themselves in the archive, the more they felt they were not studying technology at all. They were studying devotion, a devotion powerful enough to endure across epochs the way fossils endure in stone. At last, the archive transitioned into something formal. Government agencies, private institutions, and universities contributed resources to build a facility dedicated to preserving and analyzing the remnants. But when construction began, the project took on a tone very different from typical scientific installations. There was no excitement, no vanity, no triumph. The architects designed the place with dim lighting, soft acoustics, curved corridors, and quiet air spaces that felt more like a mausoleum than a laboratory. They understood instinctively what the data represented. This was not a museum of alien technology. It was a place of mourning for a galaxy that had once spoken and now lay silent. When the building opened, the scientists walked its halls in hushed tones. On the upper level, enormous screens displayed the faint pulses they had recovered, each one looping slowly, gently, like a candle flickering behind frosted glass. The patterns were broken, incomplete, but mesmerizing in their imperfection. One screen showed the 79-minute pulse from the lost courier. Another displayed a cluster
Gravitational
of
simulation
degraded sequences
active.
found near the galactic
Simulation
rim.
complete.
A third showed
Trajectory
faint
altered.
distortions mapped along the collapsed portions of the relay chain. These lights did not communicate
Warning,
anything.
deviation
They held
detected.
no syntax,
Trajectory
no
solved.
meaning, no code. They were simply all that remained. On the lower level sat something far more unsettling, a reconstructed visualization of the entire relay network during its golden age. Pieced together from corridor residues, the image was breathtaking. A web of light stretching across hundreds of parsecs,
What if
branching,
the signal
curving,
wakes up?
flowing between stars like streams
What
feeding a
if
great river.
the
To look
signal
upon it
wakes
was to
up?
see the ghost of a civilization that had once dreamt across distances so vast they dwarfed human ambition. The visualization pulsed softly, guided by the rhythms extracted from Atlas and its siblings, creating the uncanny impression of a living organism slowly breathing in its sleep. But the most haunting part of the archive was a chamber at the core of the facility. A quiet, dark room with no screens, no noise, and no lights, except a single, pulsing point suspended in a transparent sphere. That pulse was not from Atlas. It was the oldest, faintest remnant they had discovered. A signal so degraded that its cadence barely held together. The researchers called it the first echo, not because it was chronologically first, but because it felt like the last surviving heartbeat of a network now buried beneath time. When visitors entered the room, many found themselves instinctively lowering their voices, as though entering a cathedral or an ancient tomb. Some cried, some stayed in that chamber for hours, some left quietly, unable to explain what the pulse made them feel. It was not fear, it was not wonder, it was something closer to an awareness of human fragility, an understanding that communication is a temporary flame in a universe built of cold stone and endless night. As humanity studied the archive, a philosophical shift occurred. People began asking not what the message had been, but what it meant for the message to have existed at all. Some argued that the relay system must have been built during a time of crisis, a last attempt by a dying civilization to preserve its knowledge. Others believed the network was a celebration of unity, a way for distant worlds to share their discoveries. Others still thought the message might have been a warning, or a story, or even a map. But none of these theories mattered. What mattered was that the network had been built, that countless beings had contributed to it, that they believed communication across light years was worth the effort, and that they had carried that belief through centuries or millennia or even millions of years, long after the meaning itself had died. One evening, while studying the faint pulses collected in the archive, a researcher noticed something peculiar. When the remnants were sequenced according to estimated age and degradation, the rhythm showed a subtle evolution, not a pattern, not a message, but a gradual slowing, as though the relay chain's heartbeat itself had been aging over time. In its earliest remnants, the cadence was quick, steady, vibrant. In later remnants, it grew slower, as though the network was tiring. By the time Atlas carried its final echo, the beat had become soft and weary. And now, in the drifting remnants of couriers lost to deep space, the pulse was barely a whisper. It was then that the researcher realized the truth. The archive had not captured a record of the message. It had captured a record of the network growing old, a chronicle not of knowledge, but of decline, not of civilization, but of endurance, not of communication, but of loss. But strangely, this realization brought not despair, but clarity. Even in its final, broken remnants, the relay network had accomplished something extraordinary. It had allowed one civilization to reach across the galaxy long enough for another civilization, humans, to witness its final breath. The builders of the network had not intended to speak to humanity, yet humanity had become the last listener by accident. A tiny, improbable observer at the very end of a story, billions of years in the making. With this understanding, the archive adopted a final mission: not to interpret the message, not to revive the network, not to chase answers that no longer existed, but to remember, to preserve what little remained. As faithfully as the network had preserved its empty rhythms, humanity could not repay the builders, but it could honor them. And so the archive became a place of quiet guardianship. Scientists, students, poets, musicians, philosophers, people from every discipline came to study the fragments. Some wrote symphonies inspired by the pulses. Some built sculptures echoing the delicate decays. Some wrote treatises comparing the relay network to the slow collapse of ancient forests. And some simply came to sit in the chamber of the first echo, letting the faint pulse settle into their bones like a lesson older than life. In time, the archive itself became a kind of node, not a relay in the original network, but a witness node, built by a young species to preserve the memory of older ones. And far beyond the archive's walls, in the quiet spaces between stars, a few lonely pulses still drifted, broken, faint, dying. They would fade eventually, but until they did, humanity would listen. Not because the message mattered, but because listening mattered. The galaxy had spoken once, softly, beautifully, and humanity had arrived just in time to hear its final echoes. And now the archive kept those echoes alive, not to understand them, not to complete them, but simply to ensure that something, somewhere, remembered that once, long ago, a great network of minds had loved knowledge enough to send it into the dark. As the Echo Archive matured into a living monument of memory, an unexpected transformation took place.
Tracking
Not within the
convergence
data
point,
itself,
AEN.
nor in the machinery humming softly through its long hallways, but in the minds of those who dedicated their lives to deciphering the final breaths of an extinct galactic network. What was meant to be a scientific facility slowly evolved into something quieter and more profound. The people who spent long hours surrounded by the archive's dim lights and gentle displays began to speak of it as if it were alive. They described subtle changes in the atmosphere, tiny shifts in emotion that seemed to drift through the building like faint weather patterns. These impressions were not supernatural. They were human responses to sitting in the presence of something impossibly old, a message that had outlived its own meaning. Scientists accustomed to thinking only in numbers found themselves sliding into philosophical territory, wondering whether the network had ever truly died or whether its echoes were still shaping the present in ways too subtle to measure. Students who visited the archive whispered that they felt as though they had brushed against the edge of an ancient dream, something vast and fragile slowly unfolding beyond comprehension. Even custodial workers moved more softly, as if afraid to disturb the weightless memories floating through the air. The chamber of the first echo became the emotional center of the building. It housed the oldest and most degraded remnant, a faint, flickering point of light suspended inside a transparent sphere. People returned to that chamber, not to analyze the pulse, but simply to feel it. The signal was too fractured to hold information, yet it carried a strange emotional gravity. Visitors often found their breathing slowing, unconsciously syncing with its weary rhythm. Some said it helped them sleep. Others felt unsettled, as if the pulse reflected something hidden inside themselves. One night, an astrophysicist named Marin Kay sat alone in the chamber long after her shift had ended. She placed her hand on the cold surface of the sphere and imagined, only for a moment, what it might feel like to be the pulse, to be the final heartbeat of a story millions of years old, still beating only because it had forgotten how to stop. She understood then that the galaxy's vastness was not only spatial but
Tracking convergence
time
point
itself
AEN.
was layered across the sky like sediment. Civilizations rising, speaking, fading, and leaving behind whispers that outlived them by millennia. Atlas had been one such whisper. Now humanity, too, was becoming a layer in that sediment. Marin kept her revelation private, but others across the archive began experiencing similar thoughts. Something about the remnants cultivated introspection, a cosmic form of self-reflection. It wasn't the content. The message had died long ago. It was the presence. To be near the final echoes of an ancient network was to confront the fragility of one's own existence. As this realization deepened, the archive began attracting not only astronomers, but also philosophers, writers, artists, and psychologists. They came not to decode the remnants, but to understand why they stirred such emotions in every visitor. Some researchers argued that the archive acted as a psychological mirror, allowing people to project their thoughts about mortality and meaning onto something safely distant. Others believed that the remnants held emotional significance precisely because they were the fossil of a thought, the first time humanity had encountered the remains of a conversation rather than a species. And unlike bones or ruins, these fossils still pulsed. They were dead, but they moved. They were silent, but they still whispered. They were extinct, but they glowed with the faint afterimage of purpose. As discussions unfolded, the archive continued to grow. New fragments were discovered in old databases or captured by deep space telescopes. Most were barely distinguishable from noise, but sometimes, just sometimes, a remnant was clear enough to join the collection. Each new addition was handled with ceremonial care. No one referred to them as samples.
Analysis
They were called
reports
voices,
0 anomalies.
even though none of them spoke. One late evening, an engineer noticed an odd behavior across several remnant displays. It wasn't a new signal, but a synchronization, a drifting alignment among a handful of faint pulses scattered across thousands of light years. At first he assumed the new hardware was glitching, but after checking and rechecking the data, the truth became unavoidable. The remnants, despite having no communication channels between them, were flickering in a shared, gentle rhythm. Not a message, not intelligence, more like the final embers of a dying fire glowing in sympathetic waves. Marin Kay suggested a poetic explanation. The remnants are dreaming. She didn't mean literally dreaming. She meant that as the network faded, its last fragments were aligning the way cooling embers sometimes pulse together before darkening. Her words spread quietly among the team, and the metaphor stuck. The archive wasn't receiving communication. It was listening to the universe dream through its broken bones. Weeks later, an even stranger synchrony occurred. 5 scattered remnants flickered almost simultaneously, as if the fading network had gathered itself one last time, not to speak, not to warn, but simply to exist in the same moment. The synchrony lasted only a few minutes. Then
Gravitational
the pulses
simulation
drifted apart,
active.
each returning to its
Simulation
slow decay.
complete.
The
Trajectory
scientists
altered.
stood in respectful silence, realizing they had just witnessed a final,
Warning,
unplanned harmony,
deviation
a
detected.
fading choir
Trajectory
of light,
solved.
offering its last breath. In the days that followed, visitors said the archive felt different, warmer, softer, as though the remnants, exhausted after their moment of shared expression, were finally settling into rest. Perhaps it was nothing more than human imagination, but the feeling was so common that the researchers began
What
quietly
if the
acknowledging it
signal
among themselves.
wakes up?
Even Marin, who resisted
What
romantic
if the
interpretations,
signal
admitted privately
wakes up?
that the archive seemed calmer. One evening, sitting once again in the chamber of the first echo, she closed her eyes and imagined the builders of the network, the minds that once cared enough to send meaning across the stars. She wondered if they had ever known sorrow, if they had ever grieved as their own corridors crumbled, if they had mourned their civilization's slow decay. And she wondered whether, someday, far in the future, humanity's own echoes might drift through space, the same way broken, lonely, flickering, waiting for a new species to find them, and wonder who had loved knowledge enough to send it into the dark. In that moment, she understood what the archive had become. It was not a research center, not a mausoleum, not a memorial. It had become a dreamer, a place where the last echoes of a dead network were allowed to fade gently, surrounded by listeners who refused to let them disappear without witness. It was humanity's first act of cosmic empathy. And as the remnants continued their slow descent into silence, the archive embraced them in its quiet halls, keeping their echoes alive, not out of hope for meaning, but out of respect for the devotion that had carried them across the galaxy long after their purpose was forgotten. As the Echo Archive entered its later years, the remnants of the old Galactic Network began drifting into a stage the researchers quietly referred to as the fading. It was not a sudden collapse. It was not even a measurable event. It was simply a slow softening of everything: the pulses, the distortions, the spectral shadows, the emotional gravity that had once filled the archive's silent halls. The lights on the upper level, where the faint signals flickered across enormous screens, grew weaker over time. Not because the equipment failed, but because the remnants themselves were dimming. Every few months, a pulse would disappear entirely, usually without ceremony, sometimes without anyone noticing, until a routine check revealed an empty space where a faint rhythm had once lived. It was like watching stars wink out in the night sky one by one, each disappearance leaving a quiet ache behind. The scientists adjusted to this gradual loss with a kind of resigned tenderness. There was no sense in trying to prevent the fading. They understood that nothing in the archive could be revived. They could only listen while the remnants lasted and honor them when they finally dissolved. Even so, there was something unsettling about how predictable the fading became. The pulses weakened in ways that mirrored biological decline: slower rhythms, irregular patterns, longer intervals between flickers, as though the couriers and nodes were aging, despite being nothing more than drifting machinery and fragmented energy signatures. The archive began keeping a remnant ledger, a simple index marking when each pulse was first recorded and when it vanished. It was the closest thing the remnants ever had to funerals. Yet even as the signals faded, something remarkable happened. The archive's visitors did not diminish. People continued to arrive: scientists, children on field trips, pilgrims of sorts, who traveled across continents just to sit in the chamber of the first echo. They came to witness something that felt both sacred and universal: the ending of a story whose beginning no living mind would ever know. And as the hallways filled with the soft footsteps of visitors, the archive itself seemed to take on a warmer, more human quality, as though the presence of listeners anchored it gently to the world of the living. One evening, after the facility had closed to the public, Marin Kay walked alone through the upper level, passing screen after screen of fading pulses. She found herself unconsciously counting them, A dozen bright ones remained bright only in comparison to the others. 50 were weak. Another 50 hovered on the edge of imperceptibility. And behind them all lay the dark screens, blank and silent, each holding the memory of a signal that had once pulsed softly through the archive. She paused at one of the darker displays, touching the glass as though feeling for warmth. There was nothing, but she kept her hand there anyway. It felt appropriate to acknowledge the absence. When she reached the chamber of the first echo, she found the door slightly open, the glow from inside spilling faintly into the hallway. The pulse inside had grown so weak that it resembled not light, but the memory of light, a soft trembling, like the last ember in a cooling fire. Marin sat down on the floor, folding her legs beneath her, and listened as she had done countless times before. In the stillness, she imagined the vanished pulses drifting somewhere far away, not extinguished but absorbed into the fabric of the galaxy. She imagined their journeys, their endurance, their centuries of silent persistence, and she wondered whether any of them had ever been aware of their own fading. Could something without consciousness feel lonely as it dissolved into the void? Could something built only for transmission grieve the loss of its purpose? The thought was irrational, but the feeling it carried was not. Humans had always given their machines names, personalities, spirits. They anthropomorphized stones, storms, patterns in the stars. Why wouldn't they feel tenderness toward the remnants of a network that had crossed thousands of light years just to fall asleep in humanity's presence? Months passed
Tracking
in this
convergence
quiet
point
rhythm.
AEN.
Every so often, a new remnant would be discovered, an incredibly faint distortion buried in ancient survey data, but more often something disappeared. The archive staff grew adept at noticing these losses. They did not announce them publicly. Instead, they recorded them with gentle precision, entering the vanishing into the ledger along with a small note marking whatever unique pattern, cadence, or quirk the signal had possessed. They memorialized silence the way museums memorialized artifacts, preserving what little they could before time claimed the rest. Eventually, the fading reached a critical point. Only a handful of pulses remained. The once luminous map of the relay network dimmed into a sparse constellation of almost silent echoes. Even the visualization on the lower level, the one that had once pulsed gently like a sleeping organism, grew static. Without a sufficient number of remnants to provide data, the simulation could no longer breathe. It froze on a final frame, a ghostly spiderweb of light suspended above a dark void. This quiet decline left many visitors contemplative, even mournful. But as the archive approached this near silence, a new emotion emerged among those who worked there every day. Pride. They had witnessed the last flickers of a galactic choir. They had listened to it with patience and humility, and they had preserved it with reverence. Even in its near extinction, the archive did not feel empty. It felt full of everything the remnants had meant, everything they had represented, everything they had allowed humanity to feel. It was during this late stage, when only 3 distinct pulses remained, that something unexpected occurred. One afternoon, the weakest of the 3 flickered in a way it never had before. The change was not dramatic. It did not brighten or quicken or strengthen. Instead, its flickers aligned, almost imperceptibly, with the second
Analysis
pulse.
reports
Then,
0
a minute
anomalies.
later, the 3rd pulse synchronized with the first 2. It was not meaningful. It was not a message. It was simply a shared rhythm among signals that had been deteriorating separately for years. The synchrony lasted for 20 minutes longer than any previous convergence. Visitors and staff gathered silently in the gallery, watching the 3 faint lights flicker together like a trio of dying fireflies. No one spoke. No one moved. Even the air felt still, as though the archive itself were holding its breath. And then, slowly, gently, the weakest pulse faded out. 2 minutes later, the second faded, then the third. The room fell completely dark. For several long seconds, no one moved. It was as if the archive had exhaled for the final time. The silence was not emptiness, but fullness. Fullness of everything that had once been carried across the galaxy. It was a silence that did not erase, but honored. After the last pulse vanished, the archive entered a new stage of its existence. People still visited, though now the screens displayed only the saved visualizations of pulses long gone. The facility became a sanctuary for contemplation, a place where visitors could sit in the echoing stillness and think about the fragility of all things, messages,
Gravitational
civilizations,
simulation active.
dreams, even
Simulation
memory itself.
complete.
Marin
Trajectory
Kay,
altered.
who had been present for the final fading, often wandered through the building late at night,
Warning.
feeling the air
Deviation
shift
detected.
around her.
Trajectory
Softer now,
solved.
emptier, yet somehow more profound. The remnants were gone, but their presence lingered like the afterimage of a constellation after you close your eyes. Months later, Marin stood in the chamber of the first echo one last time. The sphere still hung in the center of the room, illuminated only by the soft ambient glow of the floor lights.
Wakes up.
The pulse was gone, yet the sphere remained as a monument, a relic of something humanity had witnessed at the edge of its own beginning. She rested her hand on the glass and closed her eyes, imagining the galaxy beyond a galaxy, once alive with voices, now drifting into its own silences, leaving behind only the faintest fingerprints of devotion. In that quiet, Marin understood the true nature of the archive. It had never been a place to decode an alien message. It had been a place to learn how to listen not for meaning, but for presence, not for communication, but for continuity, not for knowledge, but for endurance. And as she stepped away from the sphere and walked out of the chamber, she realized that the galaxy, in its own slow and ancient way, had sung its final chorus. Humanity had not been the intended audience, but it had been the last one. And in listening, it had become part of the choir, not a singer, not a composer, but a witness to the cosmic music that had faded long before humanity climbed down from the trees. The archive no longer pulsed. The remnants no longer flickered. The choir was gone, but the memory of its song remained a soft, enduring glow in the minds of those who heard it before it disappeared into